Welcome to the channel, everyone. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you for listening. You ever had one of those trips that sounded perfect in your head, but the second you set out, everything starts feeling wrong? That was my fishing trip to Maine last winter. My name's Arnold Stallone. I work as a lumberjack, so I'm no stranger to rough conditions, but what happened out there, it still makes my skin crawl. The plan was simple. I'd take a few days off, head to a remote cabin near Moosehead Lake, and enjoy some peace and quiet with my dog, Buck. Yeah, Buck, not the most original name, but it suits him. He's a big goofy mutt who's been my shadow for years, and honestly, he's better company than most people I know. The drive up was uneventful, but by the time I reached the cabin, the weather was turning nasty. Snow whipped against the windshield in thick, wet clumps, and the wind howled like it was trying to tear the trees out by their roots. I almost turned back, but something about the isolation appealed to me. I unloaded the truck, set up the cabin, and spent the evening sitting by the fire, watching Buck snore by the hearth. The next morning, the storm hadn't let up. It was the kind of snow that felt like it never stopped. The kind that muffled every sound and made the world feel too still. I figured I'd make the most of it and try some ice fishing on a smaller, secluded pond I'd spotted on the map. I packed my gear, threw on my thickest coat, and headed out with Buck throttling happily beside me. The pond was a couple of miles away through dense woods, the kind where the trees grow so close together that even in daylight it feels like dusk. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots and Buck's paws in the snow. About halfway there, Buck stopped dead in his tracks, ears perked and nose in the air. "What is it, boy?" I asked, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, no rustling branches, no scurrying critters, just the eerie, heavy quiet. I brushed it off and kept walking, but Buck stayed uneasy, sticking close to my side and growling under his breath. When we finally reached the pond, I set up my gear and drilled a hole in the ice. Buck sat a few feet away, still alert and watching the tree line. That's when I noticed them, tracks in the snow, on the far side of the pond. They were big, too big for a person, and they didn't look like bear prints either. The shape was strange, like elongated toes with claw marks at the end. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "Stay close, Buck," I muttered, gripping the handle of my hatchet tighter. As I started fishing, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I'd glance up at the tree line and swear I caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting between the trunks. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes, but Buck's low growls said otherwise. After an hour, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up and started heading back, but the unease only grew. The tracks appeared again, this time on my side of the pond, and they followed the path I'd taken into the woods. By the time I reached the tree line, I knew we weren't alone. I could hear something moving out there, heavy footfalls crunching through the snow. It kept its distance, but matched our pace, circling us like a predator sizing up its prey. "Come on, Buck, let's move," I said, my voice shaking. The creature kept circling, always just out of sight, but I could hear its breathing, low, guttural, and wet, like it was struggling to contain some primal rage. My mind raced. I'd seen a movie once about something like this, a creature from some legend or folklore, but I couldn't remember the name. Wendigo? Maybe? Skinwalker? Whatever it was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. The storm made it hard to navigate, and the growing dark didn't help. I clutched my hatchet like a lifeline, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. Buck stayed at my side, his growls constant now. Then it happened, a blur of motion to my left, a shape that was too tall, too fast to be anything natural. It let out a sound that froze me in place, a mix of a scream and a roar that seemed to echo inside my skull. I swung the hatchet wildly, not caring if I hit anything, and bolted. The truck wasn't far now, maybe half a mile, but the creature didn't let up. It darted through the trees, keeping pace with us, its guttural breathing louder than the storm. Buck barked and lunged at it a few times, giving me just enough time to keep moving. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw the truck, I felt a surge of relief. I threw open the door, shoved Buck inside, and climbed in after him, slamming the door just as something massive crashed into the side of the truck. I didn't look, I couldn't. I jammed the keys into the ignition, praying the engine would start, and when it did, I floored it. The tires skidded on the icy road, but we got out of there. I didn't stop driving until we were miles away, the storm still raging behind us. When I finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, all I saw was snow and darkness. I don't know what we saw out there, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that something is stalking those woods, something that shouldn't exist, and I'm never going back to find out. Hello everyone, and welcome. I hope you like the stories. Please drop me a comment or give me a thumbs up if you do. Enjoy the rest of the stories. Let me tell you about the worst trip of my life. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a quiet getaway to a cabin in Montana. I needed a break from the monotony of my postal route in Los Angeles. And what better place to clear your head than the middle of nowhere? Sunny weather, open skies, and no one to bother me except for my dog, Rusty. He's a wiry little terrier mix, sharp as a tack and twice as scrappy. The cabin sat near the edge of a thick forest, the kind that seems alive with its own secrets. I'd rented it for a week, thinking I could relax, maybe even get in some trail runs to keep up with my gym routine. The days were quiet and uneventful at first. Rusty loved sniffing around the property, chasing squirrels and generally acting like the king of the wilderness. But things took a turn around the third day. That's when I first noticed something was off. I'd taken Rusty for a late afternoon walk along a trail that wound deeper into the forest. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows through the trees. At first it was peaceful, the kind of scene that makes you forget about city life. Then Rusty stopped dead in his tracks. His ears perked and a low growl rumbled from his throat. I followed his gaze to the tree line, but I didn't see anything. Still, the air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. "Come on, buddy," I said, tugging lightly on his leash, but Rusty wouldn't budge. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint but deliberate, like something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the frantic scurrying of a deer or the flutter of a bird. This was low, calculated, and it was circling us. I tightened my grip on the leash and tried to keep my voice steady. "Let's head back." As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Rusty kept glancing over his shoulder, and every so often I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. By the time we reached the cabin, my nerves were shot. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rusty paced near the door, growling intermittently. I sat by the window, peering out into the moonlit yard. That's when I saw them, tracks in the dirt just beyond the cabin. They were huge, like they belonged to some kind of massive dog, but the spacing was all wrong. Whatever made them was walking on two legs. I spent the next day holed up in the cabin, researching local wildlife and trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That's when I stumbled across reports of strange sightings in the area, accounts of a creature that sounded suspiciously like a werewolf. I'd always thought those stories were just folklore, but the details matched too closely to ignore. That evening, I armed myself with a hatchet from the shed and a hefty flashlight. I wasn't about to be caught off guard again. Rusty stayed close as we ventured out to investigate the tracks. The sun was setting and the forest was eerily quiet. We didn't make it far. The moment we stepped into the clearing, I felt it, that oppressive, watching presence. Rusty barked furiously, lunging at something I couldn't see. Then it happened. The creature burst from the shadows with terrifying speed, slamming into the tree beside us with a force that shook the ground. It was massive, towering over me, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Its body was covered in matted fur and its elongated snout revealed rows of jagged teeth. I froze, but Rusty didn't. He lunged at the thing, barking like his life depended on it. The distraction gave me just enough time to grab the hatchet and swing wildly. The blade glanced off the creature's arm, and it let out a guttural snarl that made my blood run cold. "Rusty, come on!" I shouted, grabbing him by the collar and bolting toward the cabin. The creature gave chase, its footfalls heavy and relentless. We barely made it inside. I slammed the door and wedged the chair under the handle, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature circled the cabin, its claws scraping against the walls. Rusty barked incessantly, and I could hear its growls growing louder, more furious. I knew we couldn't stay. Grabbing the car keys, I made a break for the truck parked just outside. The creature was waiting, its hulking form illuminated by the headlights. I revved the engine, flooring it toward the road as the thing leaped at the truck, leaving a massive dent in the hood. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. Rusty sat in the passenger seat, trembling but unharmed. My hands were still shaking when I finally pulled into a gas station to call the rental company and tell them they could keep the cabin. I don't know what I saw out there, and I'm not sure I want to, but one thing's for sure, I'm never going back. Have you ever had one of those trips where everything that can go wrong does? That's how this one started. Me, Jake and Miguel, my closest friends since high school, had planned a road trip through the Pacific Northwest. We figured it'd be a nice way to unwind, get out of Denver for a bit. The three of us rarely had time off together. Me being a cop, Jake running his own construction company, and Miguel working insane hours as a paramedic. The first couple of days were great. We drove through lush green forests, stopped at quirky roadside diners, and even hiked a bit. But on the third day, everything went sideways. We were driving along a remote stretch of road surrounded by towering evergreens when the car sputtered and died. Jake, who was driving, cursed under his breath and pulled over to the shoulder. We all got out to check under the hood, but none of us were mechanics. After poking around uselessly, we decided to walk back to the gas station we'd passed about 5 miles back. It was still light on and the weather was calm, so we figured it'd be a nice walk. About halfway there, things started to feel off. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It felt like the trees were closing in around us, their shadows stretching long and dark across the road. Jake was the first to break the silence. "You guys feel that?" "Feel what?" I asked, though I already knew what he meant. "Like we're being watched," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Miguel tried to laugh it off. "Probably just some deer or something. We're in the middle of nowhere, remember?" But I wasn't so sure. There was something about the stillness, the weight of the air that didn't feel right. I kept my hand on the knife I always carried on my belt, an old habit from the job. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Hey, you guys know about skinwalkers?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Miguel groaned. "Here we go. Brian's gonna tell us another one of his cop stories." "I'm serious," I said. "I saw this TV special about them once. Navajo legend. Supposed to be witches that can shapeshift into animals or people. They stalk their prey, mess with their minds before they strike." Jake laughed. "Great, so now we are being hunted by witches. Thanks for that." But even he didn't sound convinced. We made it to the gas station just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was one of those old, run-down places with a single pump and a flickering neon sign. The attendant, an older guy with a grizzled beard, told us he could call for a tow truck, but it'd be a couple of hours. So we waited. That's when things got worse. It started with a noise, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Rusty, the station's stray dog, started barking furiously, his hackles raised. "What the hell was that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, the lights in the station flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Miguel pulled out his phone, using his flashlight to scan the area. That's when we saw it, a figure at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the light. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Get inside," I yelled, pulling Jake and Miguel toward the station. We barricaded ourselves in the small office, the door held shut with a metal filing cabinet. Outside we could hear the creature moving, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, just barely audible over the pounding of our hearts, but then grew louder, more insistent. They sounded like our own voices, calling out to each other from the darkness. "That's not us," I said, my voice shaking. "Don't listen to it." Jake and Miguel nodded, their faces pale. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped. We cautiously stepped outside, only to find Rusty gone. In his place was a single footprint, larger than any human's, with elongated toes and claw marks. The tow truck finally arrived, and we wasted no time getting the hell out of there. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night, but I'll tell you one thing, I'm never setting foot in the Pacific Northwest again. You know how people joke about taking a camping trip to get away from it all? Turns out there is a reason some places should just stay forgotten. It started as a spur of the moment decision. Me, Frank and Eddie, all of us blue-collar guys who work together at the shop, figured we'd take a weekend off and drive up to Maine for some camping. Autumn in New England sounded perfect. Crisp air, colorful leaves, and the kind of peace you don't find in Boston. We drove Eddie's beat-up truck out to a spot near the edge of the woods. The area was remote, but not too far from a small town called Millinocket. I'd fixed up cars like Eddie's a dozen times before, so I was half expecting us to break down before we got there. But the truck held up, and we made it to the campsite just before sunset. The wind had been picking up all day, rustling through the trees like whispers in a church. It gave the place an eerie vibe, but we chalked it up to the season. After setting up camp, we built a fire, cracked open a few beers, and swapped stories. At some point, the conversation turned to cryptids, those strange creatures people claim to see in the woods. Frank brought up Bigfoot, Eddie laughed about chupacabras, and I mentioned something I'd come across on YouTube a few weeks ago, the Rougarou. Never heard of it, Eddie said, tossing another log onto the fire. It's like a werewolf, but worse, I explained. Some say it's a cursed human, others think it's just a beast. Either way, it's bad news. Supposedly, it hunts at night and doesn't stop until it's killed you or worse. Frank snorted. Come on, Garrett, you're telling me you believe that crap? I don't, I lied. Just thought it was interesting. The truth, those videos had stuck with me. The way people described it, its glowing red eyes, the stench of rotting meat, the sound of its growls made my skin crawl, but I wasn't about to admit that to the guys. The wind howled louder as the night wore on. The fire danced and flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. We were just starting to pack it in when we heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the trees. Did you hear that? Eddie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Probably just an animal, Frank said, though his hand tightened around the flashlight he was holding. But it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was deep, menacing, and way too close for comfort. Then the attack came. Out of nowhere, something massive lunged at Eddie, knocking him to the ground. It moved too fast for us to get a good look, but I saw enough to know it wasn't human. Its limbs were long, its claws glinting in the firelight. Get off him! Frank shouted, grabbing a branch from the fire and swinging it at the creature. The flames licked its hide, and it let out an ear-piercing screech before retreating into the woods. Eddie scrambled to his feet, his face pale. What the hell was that? I don't know, I said, my voice shaking, but we need to get out of here. We grabbed whatever we could carry, knives, flashlights, anything that might be useful, and doused the fire. The truck was parked about half a mile away, but it might as well have been 10 miles in those conditions. The wind masked the sounds of the creature, but every now and then we'd catch a glimpse of it in the shadows, circling us. It was toying with us, waiting for the right moment to strike again. When it finally did, it went after Frank. One moment he was walking ahead of us, the next he was gone. We heard him scream, followed by a sickening ripping sound. Frank! Eddie yelled, running toward the noise. Wait! I grabbed his arm. It's too late. But... Listen to me, I said, forcing him to look at me. We can't help him. If we don't keep moving, we're dead too. Reluctantly, he nodded, and we pressed on. The rest of the night was a blur. We moved as silently as we could, using the trees for cover. Every so often, we'd hear the creature's growls or see its glowing eyes in the distance. It was relentless, but so were we. Finally, just as dawn began to break, we spotted the truck. I don't think I've ever run so fast in my life. Eddie fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, but we managed to get inside and lock the doors just as the creature burst out of the woods. It slammed against the truck, its claws raking across the metal, but Eddie floored it. and we sped down the dirt road as fast as the old engine would allow. We didn't stop until we reached Millinocket. To this day, I don't know what we saw there. I've tried to tell myself it was just wild animal, but deep down, I know better. So yeah, if you ever think about going camping in Maine, don't. You ever have one of those experiences that makes you question everything? I'm not talking about the little stuff, like what you had for dinner last night. I mean the big questions, like whether the world is a whole lot stranger than you thought. That's what happened to me this past spring. Me, my buddies Rick and Tom, and my dog Max decided to go camping in Montana. The weather was perfect, sunny, just warm enough to make you forget it was still spring. We'd all been working crazy hours back in Boston, and we figured this would be a great way to blow off some steam. We found a spot deep in the woods, way off the beaten path. It wasn't an official campsite, but Rick swore he'd been there before and that it was perfect. I don't know if you've ever been to Montana, but the wilderness out there is something else. Towering pines, clear skies, the kind of silence that feels almost sacred. I brought Max along because, well, he's my shadow. Big scruffy German shepherd mix with a bark that will make you think twice about messing with me. Plus, he loves the outdoors as much as I do. We spent most of the first day hiking, cracking jokes and setting up camp. I even had some time to show off my cooking skills, whipping up some chili over the fire. Rick and Tom were impressed, said I should open a food truck or something. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mood shifted. The forest got quieter, like something had sucked all of the life out of it. Even Max, who usually barked at every squirrel and bird, seemed on edge. "Did you guys hear that?" Rick asked, breaking the silence. "Hear what?" Tom replied, but his voice was lower, like he didn't really want to know the answer. There it was again, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Max growled, low in his throat, his ears flat against his head. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound casual, but deep down I wasn't so sure. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. Max stayed close to me, his body tense. I couldn't sleep though, every little sound had me on edge. At some point I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, Max was barking like crazy. I scrambled out of the tent, flashlight in hand. That's when I saw it. There was something just beyond the edge of the firelight. I couldn't make out much, just a shape, low to the ground, moving with an unnatural grace. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen. "Rick, Tom!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. They came stumbling out of their tents, flashlights swinging wildly. The creature, whatever it was, darted away, its movements always serpentine. "What the hell was that?" Rick whispered. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we are not sticking around to find out." We packed up as quickly as we could, tossing everything into backpacks. The plan was simple: head back to the car, no stops. The walk back was a nightmare. The creature didn't attack again, but it was out there, stalking us from the shadows. Every so often we'd catch a glimpse of it, just a flicker of movement between the trees. Max growled the whole time, his hackles raised. Tom had a hunting knife. Rick carried a tire iron he'd grabbed from the truck earlier. Me? I had a flashlight and a sheer determination. About halfway back, we came across something that made my stomach drop. A deer carcass, torn to shreds. The wounds were wrong, too clean, too precise, like whatever had done it wasn't just killing for food. "We need to keep moving," I said, my voice shaking. By the time we reached the car, we were all out of breath. The creature was close now. I could feel it watching us, its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. Rick fumbled with the keys, cursing under his breath. "Hurry up!" Tom shouted, his eyes darting around. Finally, the engine roared to life. We piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the creature lunged out of the trees. I only got a good look at it for a second, but that was enough. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow, its body twisted and unnatural, like it was caught halfway between forms. It slammed against the car, leaving a dent in the door, but Rick hit the gas and we sped down the dirt road. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. I've tried to make sense of what happened that night. Maybe it was some kind of mutant animal or a trick of the light, but deep down I know better. I haven't been camping since. Thank you for sticking around, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the stories. And now, have a good night. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good night.